This week in the conversation, I have the honor to receive author Fazle Chowdhury. We're going to be speaking about his latest novel titled The Secrets We Live In. Interesting, intriguing title, wonderful story. It's a historical fiction thriller. But before we get into this wonderful video, I just want to take this short moment again just to remind you it's important to tell friends and family to subscribe to this YouTube channel, your best literary show out there, specifically within our Twitter community. But if you also haven't subscribed, I'm encouraging you to do so. And if you do, don't forget to click the notification bell so that way every time a video is posted, it's going to you as soon as possible, directly on your portal. So let's get started. Again, my name is Ardain Isma, and I'm here this evening with an impressive author. I'm here with Fazle Chowdhury. We're going to be speaking about his wonderful historical fiction thriller titled Secrets That We Live In, right? Okay. So I'm very fascinated with the story because of the fact that I'm a big fan of historical fiction myself. And before the start of this conversation, you and I were talking about Professor Sader, as I was saying, and he's a history professor, and he also has written several biographies of people who in the past, have made history. And I now understand what it means, what we call sometimes creative nonfiction. It's basically the author picks up the story, from the standpoint of major historical events and embellish that with beautiful novelistic prose. And that's exactly what I saw when I was reading your book.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
So, Fazle, welcome to the conversation.
No, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Now, would you please tell the viewers of CSMS Magazine who is Fazle Chowdhury?
Okay. Well, please call me Fazle. And I'm a longtime fellow at the Global Policy Institute. I am a longtime professor of organization management. And before that, I was a management consultant for a majority of my time. I got a chance to travel extensively in places where usually management consultants don't go to. But that is where a vast number of my novels have centered on. And for your readers, might find this compelling that though I got a chance to travel abroad as an adult, even in my youth, I had a chance to travel mainly because of my parents, who traveled pretty frequently, gave myself a pretty good exposure to a world where I was always different in the context of being a foreigner. And I think the only place that I found to be my home, primarily my adult life, is particularly here in the United States. So that's me.
Great. I was just listening to you speaking, and I just could see myself because of the fact that I wasn't born in the United States. I was born in a tropical island in the Caribbean. That a whole lot of people, for some reason or another, they seem to overlook, which is Haiti. But in the past also had made history for having been the only country in the world to have defeated slavery, and doing so defeated the three most powerful colonial powers at that time.
That's right.
They defeated the Spaniard, they defeated the British, and ultimately defeated Napoleon and declared themselves independent. But not everybody understand that. Certainly not many Americans really know about this beautiful history of Haiti, how it all began. All we know basically is the contemporary history, which began with US occupation in 1915, and for 100 years of foreign interference in Haiti's political affairs, the country simply disintegrated. So not everybody really understands that. But as a Haitian American, listening to you, Fazle, I can see myself because I love to travel. I travel a lot with my wife and children from Europe to the Caribbean and other places. And everything I see when I travel, there's no such thing of paradise on earth, really. I see ordinary people going about their business, try to make a difference in their life so they can live peacefully with dignity. So that's what I see. When I was reading your book, I became very much intrigued to learn about, somehow you give us a window of how to understand, and to some extent, what the world doesn't see, especially when it comes to play geopolitics.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, this novel, The Secrets We Live In, is really an episode of multiple episodes of chaos. And it is chaos personified, but it's chaos personified in the view of the characters that are in it. And if you were to see parallels of it in reality, you will find that in any kind of political and economic situation. In this novel, primarily, I picked a spot where the individuals that I marked around were really kind of this imagination I had years back. I've had friends in the Foreign Service, I've had friends in the military, I've had friends who often used to talk to me late at night because they never had time in what we would consider a normal time. And as I was writing this book, I kind of consolidated all those episodes. But in those consolidation, there is this episode that I tried to hone in, and I don't think I did a good job, particularly because initially the book was supposed to be a romance novel. That was the premise behind it, but unfortunately, as I was writing it and as I gravitated towards finalizing the story, somehow the love story or the romance story just got to be more behind than the primary message. But at the end, I was happy how it came out. But at the end of the day, you never get the director's cut to be better than the movie. It's
exactly
than the director's cut.
Exactly. But let me ask you something now. Right off the bat of the book now, Fazle. So it says that what happens when a new ambassador in Paris really finds himself in the middle of a catastrophic scheme. So what happened? Can you really give us a window? I'm not asking you to tell the plot of the story.
Sure. So the story is that here is an appointed ambassador who has been given a task to make sure that an agreement is completed so that the benefits of that agreement can help the regime that has put him in Paris to get the agreement finalized. The problem is that he is a very flawed individual to the point that he lives with a past that he has not completely shaken himself away from. He enjoys parties. He enjoys the fun of the parties. He does not enjoy the work that he has been assigned to, that he has to take seriously. And to do that, he has a staff that is constantly around him, hoping that he can fall in alignment with what he is really intended to be in Paris for, which often doesn't happen. And in the story, I have specifically made sure that I had placed the flaws of this character much more in the surface than his better points. His better points does come upon later, and the reader can find it. But the plot, as I was saying, is really centered around a deal that he has to complete. But he doesn't, or at first that is not his priority, although it does become a priority later on.
Now, on page 42, you're very clear on that. And you say at the center of these parties was always one man, the ambassador, who was constantly throwing lavish parties, lavish dinners and galas before the mansion was fully constructed. And you went on to say at the bottom of the paragraph, you said the mansion was was visually spectacular and displayed a symbol of cooperative diplomacy. Can you teach us a little bit, Fazle? What do you mean by cooperative diplomacy?
So, for some of the readers who had exposure to going to embassies, and particularly foreign embassies, one of the things that often attracts someone who's visiting these places is that, they're very grand, they're very big, they look almost close to palaces, but they're not exactly places where you can actually think of having a party for kids. You can't celebrate, birthday parties. You feel restricted. And so the story here particularly is that when the ambassador comes in and finds the mansion that he's assigned, he thinks it's really horrible. He said, if I'm supposed to bring in about 500 people for a party, there's no way they can even fit through the door. Not even the floor can accommodate 30 or 40. So what he decides is he moves his mansion away from the inner, really downtown Paris, and builds this lavish mansion. He is spending way over budget. He actually spends a lot of his own money. But a lot of that own money is not really his, because it really belongs to his mother. And he's incurring these bills, and his staff is constantly getting worried, because as these bills pile up, the parties are continuing. They are going on, they're incurring a lot more debt. And keep in mind that the country that he represents is not a well-to-do country in terms of economic wealth. It has significant economic problems. It has a lot of poverty. But I didn't go into the details of what that country is. I left that to be a mystery for the reader.
Exactly. So I was going to ask you that question, because through the end, I couldn't really understand what country. I guess you purposely live it this way. So
yes. Yeah, it was intended for that way, not because of that's how ambassadors act, but more particularly that this individual who loves the idea of interaction, who loves the idea of having a really defined relationship with his guests, his friends, his way of getting away from the hard part of being an ambassador, really just doesn't care at the end of the day how much money he spends, no matter if it's his or others or even his own family's, only for the reason that he wants that human connection in some way, shape, or form.
Now, at the beginning of the story, there's a character who was literally kidnapped and being interrogated. I think it's Yuli from Belo Horizonte, and is that the city of Brazil that you're referring to?
No, that's a common mistake everyone makes. There's actually about 5 cities.
Belo Horizonte?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I take that back. It's not 5 cities. They're 4 towns, 1 city. And so you're absolutely right, Adrian. You would think that is a Brazilian city. And for the sake of our conversation, let it be the Brazilian city, because I think in context to what happens with this individual, it's very relevant.
Yeah, because you mentioned, because you know what, there's a lot of reference to World War II
Mhm.
and its aftermath. And also, we all know the stories of Nazi collaborators or Nazi officers migrated to South America,
Mhm.
and many of them, were integrated into society.
Mhm.
So when I saw Belo Horizonte, immediately this is what came to mind. I said, well, maybe this gentleman was some of the Nazi collaborators or someone. Now you just clarify that for me, and of course for the viewers, for your readers out there.
Yeah, I mean there is that semblance, but I mean it is partially meant to create the additional mystery around the novel. The novel the novel has a very defined story. Unfortunately, initially I had made it into a maze, hoping that I would enjoy the fact that the reader will find it a little compelling, a little difficult to really understand what was going on. But as I wrote it more and more, I realized I had made it so complicated, and and later on when I revised it, I made it as less complicated as I possibly could. But even those that I had it read before publication, they said, no, it's still complicated. You might want to readjust it. But I'm glad, Adrian, you tapped onto a few things that only makes this exactly the way I want it to sound. So thank you.
Okay. This character, I think his name is Eldan, if I don't remember. I'm trying to get, but
Eldan, yes.
Yeah, his family originated from Poland, I believe, and
I think you meant Belgium, probably.
Yeah, and I mean split. In the aftermath of the German occupation of Poland.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, one side of the family went to Paris and ultimately ended up being killed by the Nazis, and the other side of the family, who immigrated to Los Angeles, survived.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. I mean, again, I think it's partially my fault that I kind of left it vague in terms of my descriptions. But yes, you can certainly get that feeling that not Belgium, but more so Poland because of the nature of events. But yes, you are right. There are the family does one side of the family that did go to Los Angeles did survive, and they survived well. And the character, particularly Eldan, who is really a better version of his own father, comes to the understanding that institutions in the United States are much better built, and the spirit of it is much more well in tune with the realities of the times, because in his own prejudices, he feels that some of the horrors of World War II, Europe simply hasn't still gotten around to it. And the novel is and the character of this novel, particularly Eldan, he's more moralistic than the main character, Zain Ozar, who's the ambassador that you spoke about earlier. He is there to correct the wrong. But in his view, correcting the wrong is not necessarily doing the right thing. It's actually doing a lot of bad things first. And so in his world, he kind of identifies what is bad and what is good in his own version, which is not necessarily accurate for the times. And so it was, for me, to build that character was very important, because I needed to make someone who was everything what the ambassador wasn't, but still have some flaws that resonated with some of the things that the ambassador or Zain had, that is much more contradictory, because I didn't want it to be the same person.
Correct.
But throughout the story, it's a good parallel because in one sense, they're both trying to do the right thing, and they end up doing several things that are not exactly right. But luck favors them. Luck actually pushes them to a way, and circumstances pushes them to a way where they actually thrive in what they initially wanted to do.
This is so compelling. You just made a reference earlier to with regard to Europe, and this is an area, a geography which produced two major wars, which we call World War I and World War II. And if we take a look at what's going on right now in the world, especially with regard to the situation in eastern Ukraine or in Ukraine, and you tend to understand somehow lots of mistakes that happened pre-World War I and World War II seem to be somehow repeating again. At the time, I think the world would need more peace than war. I'm in favor of waging peace at all costs, but avoiding war at all costs also. This is the kind of question. That's
no, and you've said it in a very nice way, Adrian, because in this novel, there are several opportunities of peace. What's interesting is that the characters don't like those options. There's a chapter in the book where the ambassador goes to a refugee camp in a fictitious town, and in this fictitious town, he sees the horrors of what has happened, the conditions they live in, and he's not so much convinced of the horrors as he is convinced of the little children that really affect him. There's a moment where he sees the eyes of a child, and that is when it brings this emotion in him of a life that he could have had, and a life that would have been much more peaceful than the parties and the joy that he has at the present.
It's a beautiful contrast.
Yeah, and for me, it was important to mention that because, as you say, what is happening in eastern Ukraine, particularly in the Donbass area, and what was happening even before that moment, when you had a flood of refugees that was trying to escape. And my assessment of particularly refugees in Europe was particularly honed in from the time in 2013. I saw it, I read about it, I had friends who were involved to being part of aid agencies that told me stories about it. And I've included some of the fact in my own imagination to what I saw and replicated that in this novel. And you very well could say, did this resonate with you? It did. It's when you're, for me, when you see these images, particularly as a person, and when you particularly see the state of how children are affected, it's a horrible sight. And I intentionally put it there. I intentionally put this in this novel so that readers could understand, particularly like for someone like myself who saw it in person, who can visualize it even now, years later, and how it affects any individual. I mean, let alone the character in this novel. The character in this novel sees it, and it's really, he doesn't want to see it, and he's pushed to see it by his Haitian general friend, who is the chief of staff, who says, you need to see this. You need to see this not because of the fact that it's wrong, but because you need to help us fix this somehow. And he looks at it, and initially why he doesn't want to help. He comes to find out that the only reason he wants to help is not because of the people, but rather the children that are suffering. He doesn't have any children. And he sees the state of what a little girl is going through.
Right.
And one which I tried to describe as much as I could.
Right.
And it is then that he realizes that no, he might have a task as an ambassador first, but this takes precedence.
Right. Let me ask you something. We know that fiction reflects reality. And then growing up, you were born in the United States, right?
No, I was born outside the United States. I spent a lot of time in Europe. I spent a lot of time in Central Asia.
Central Asia, okay.
Mainly because of my father's work, and he was a diplomat. And I still remember when I would. I think some recollection was when I was 10 years old, and I asked one of his friends what he did for a living, and and he said, well, it's kind of complicated. And I said, well, I can ask someone down the road, and it's such a simple answer. Why is it complicated? And years later, I came to understand that he just didn't want to say he was the ambassador to Bulgaria. But that world was different. Nowadays, if somebody were to ask me, what do you do for a living, I would say, yeah, I work for a think tank. It's called Global Policy Institute. That's what I do. I would love to be a historian. Some friends of mine tell me I'm a historian, but I'm really not. I'm a good student of history. But to answer your question, I grew up in different circles, different fragments, and different areas which were very different to the life that I live now. Had I grew up in the United States, I probably would have not written these kind of novels. I probably would have written novels that were much more closer to what my nephews and nieces tell me to write about. They say, Uncle, why don't you write about this team that is kind of having a problem with really building a real team around a town, and a town that needs to support them. And I love those stories. I really do. It's just that it's very difficult to have those kind of stories, as well as have this nagging voice behind your head saying well, is there something wrong in this town? Is there something wrong with the air? Is there something wrong with a tree that's there? Do you want to question that more? And when I do these writing exercises, I tend to gravitate towards, at first I have these great ideas, but those great ideas get shunned out as I write to the 200th draft or 215th draft, and it becomes something else. And then, when the publisher sees it, they're like, this is good, but focus on this more. And it often turns out to be what you say, Adrian, is very historical fiction or political thriller. That's.
But let me ask you a question. This is the last question because we're running out of time. I want your, can you advise a reader out there who would want to follow your path of becoming such an impeccable, critically acclaimed author as you are? What's the secret?
Well, I don't think I'm the best person to say, to give that advice. When I became an author, it was really at the urgency of a friend. And the circumstances just allowed it. But if you have a passion for writing, I think, you should write how you feel like writing, and don't let anyone else tell you that you're wrong. One of the things that I remember constantly was en route to publishing. There were a lot of people who said to me, this is not going to work out. No reader appreciates this. You're not going to be able to get to an actual publishing platform where people can appreciate what you write. At the end of the day, every writer needs to understand one central lesson, and that is there's a story that's inside of your mind. Unless you say it and write it like the way you believe that it should put
It should be written.
it should be written, that nagging feeling won't go away.
Exactly.
And if you listen to others, while that might be great for the moment, it won't serve your soul as a writer, because the soul doesn't rest until your spirit gravitates those words into a form of a paper.
Correct. Well said. Well said. And on this wonderful note, I'm just going to say it's been more than a pleasure to sit down and have such a really inspiring, interesting, wonderful conversation with critically acclaimed author Fazle Chowdhury.
Thank you, Adrian.